Hello everybody, so thank you for watching this video. This is actually a recording of a talk that I gave to FinStick, so that's the Financial Systems Innovation Centre in September, and I hope I can be part of encouraging you to sign up to that group. So in terms of this talk, I should say that this is very much my own reading up, my own work and my conclusions, and it's not those of any organisation that I work or volunteer for. And you may be wondering whether this affects the investment strategy of any of the products I look after. But I think the simple answer is that it's a bit too early for that. And today, really, I'm talking about an approach which could result in a grand synthesis of physical laws and economics. But we are really quite far from that now. And it will take a lot more research to bring applications for investors out of this. It is my hope, though, that the eventual conclusions of the work here could be incorporated in future and indeed lead us to a better understanding of sustainability and therefore of sustainable investment. My background before becoming an actuary and entering the City of London was in physical sciences, which may well come across in the way that I address the topics today. But I have been mystified by the lack of a grand theory of economics, which was available to me as a physicist, or at least the hope of finding one was. And tangible progress towards this is being made all the time. So you could position my talk today as a physicist's overview of science, which I think is missing from current economic thinking and investment practice, and science which could form the foundations of the next wave of investment theory and economic thought. So the sources of my confusion with the economic system, I want to start here with a problem set which are really things I'm surprised aren't better explained in terms of physical interpretations of the world within economics. So this one is probably the hardest and is a major issue. Why is there no definition of sustainability? Human activity is clearly having a major impact on the natural environment, and the functioning of a modern technological capitalist system is clearly having a major impact on the human social environment. But there are no guiding principles explaining why that is. Sustainability can't be, in my view, the same as meeting the needs of this generation without imperiling the next generation's ability to meet theirs, which was the Brundtland Commission's version of sustainable development. That doesn't address what those needs are, and clearly greed and defining needs to mean getting ever more and more is a part of what's unsustainable. So why the obsession with growth? Organisms grow, but not forever, and ecosystems reach a point of maturity and stop growing, in that the trees in a forest have a range of ages and the same organisms live within the forest. Economic or capitalist systems just can't seem to do that. There's some sort of internal pressure they feel which keeps pushing them on. Now, I can't tell whether this growth could be unsustainable, but the fact that growth can't be mapped onto the natural world is concerning to me. Our economics appears to be predicated on growth without considering whether there are limits to that growth, and that can't result in sustainability. So what is an information economy? There are many ways to think about it, but in a world of digital everything, what is the place of digital goods? How is it, in other words, that Taylor Swift makes money? That's not a comment on her music, but how can something we perceive to be purely information-based, like entertainment, can make an economic impact? So what is the purpose of money, finance, and profit? So the financial community has a lot of talk about purpose, which I think is very important. We do need our financial institutions to be more purposeful. But really here, I mean, what is the point of these things? The ecosystem doesn't have any of them, and it's doing fine, or maybe it would be if we didn't have these things. Maybe debt and the payment of interest is the reason for the growth obsession. So why do these things exist? They may cause more damage than good. And finally, there is a huge focus on evolution in biosciences, and it is more than 50 years since Richard Dawkins introduced the word mimetic to complement genetic as a description of the information which might evolve. But it is very hard to find evolution described in economics. I'll come on to describing technological evolution as hyper-evolutionary or divorced from the need to be born and reproduced. and the rapid pace of change now must make evolution a vital topic. But understanding evolution seems to be mostly absent from the way investment theory works. Now, in setting out these problems, I do want to call out the naturalist fallacy, which you might be suspecting I hold. I do not think that everything natural is good and that everything human is unnatural and therefore bad. I'm instead highlighting that we seem to think of our processes as being distinct from nature. If there was a breakpoint where a special thing happened in human or social evolution, we do seem currently unable to point to it. We have to be able to explain humans and the economy as being part of nature. And that angle is intended to show what is different about the economy from nature and what is the same. So to give an overview of what I want to talk about, I'm going to start with a simple statement. Everything is made up of matter, energy, and the way these things are arranged, or information. Information is special in that it can be separated from the configurations of energy and matter it relates to. Information can both be embodied in those configurations or virtual when it acts as instructions about how to arrange things. So to find a general approach to understanding economics, I think we need to deal with three different topics and to try to triangulate a path to bring them together in a holistic synthesis, a systemic approach. So thermodynamics, you may know as the study of heat in gases tending to diffuse and create order over time. But more recent work is actually more constructive in its outlook, and it shows that the pressures to grow and evolve are both the inevitable result of thermodynamic laws. The existence of free energy gradients actually compels systems to create structures spontaneously to help diffuse energy. Those are the natural and economic structures we see around us all. I'll start by looking at thermodynamics today, trying to explain the technical parts we need to understand economics. I will then look at how information goes about copying and disseminating itself, a topic that I call replication. This is really my own work, so I'll be very interested to hear whether you find it compelling afterwards. Essentially, this starts by looking at how living organisms go about copying themselves and taking over energy gradients. By following an analogous process for human information, I believe we gain a first principles description of how the real economy is formed. We can also start to get into why human information differs from DNA, why economic and social structures differ from organisms and the ecosystem. So unfortunately, I won't get enough time to look at ecology today, but this is increasingly a science of how organic structures organize themselves along thermodynamic principles to carry out the functions of replication, and an approach to understanding whether systems are sustainable. So I suspect that that's the topic of a whole other talk. As an introduction to more modern thermodynamics, I do want to do a quick overview of the thermodynamics that I was taught at university. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it does offer a very different position to later thermodynamics and its role in economics. Much of this is what I want to overhaul. Classical thermodynamics really came out of engineering in that from the late 17th century onwards, people were trying to explain the basic properties of matter, and in particular, how their developing steam engines worked. So in brief, the results I'd like to highlight are that heat is work and work is heat. So you can make the flow of heat from a hotter to cooler objects do work, like driving a wheel or pumping water with a steam engine. But you can't build machines which make these energy conversions perfectly. Some energy always gets a little lost in the transfer, and that means that there are no perpetual motion machines. So here we have a water pumping machine which uses the water it has pumped as its energy source. This machine works in that you can fill up the top tank with water and it will start pumping water. But it will not do this indefinitely, as it can't pump up the same amount of water as it uses to drive the pump. At some stage, the top tank will run dry. So there are no perpetual motion machines. Heat is in fact the random motion of molecules. So the molecules in a gas, which is hotter, move faster than they do in a cooler gas. And that explains why hot gases expand or increase the pressure on their surroundings. So heat will inevitably become evenly distributed. So if I start with a situation where there is a concentrated pocket of hotter molecules in a gas, over time, they will share out their energy with the other gas molecules by colliding with them. This state is called thermal equilibrium. The temperature is even throughout the sample. Now, I've said evenly distributed, but in fact, the answer is that they fall into a statistical distribution, Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution. And this gives the distribution of speeds the molecules in a gas will have. But one of the most profound consequences of classical thermodynamics is that over time disorder will increase throughout the universe. In fact, it really says that time is created by the progress of the universe moving towards a future where all heat is evenly distributed. This is called the heat death of the universe, when temperature is even everywhere. And spoiler alert, it will be cold. Overall, this is referred to as the second law of thermodynamics. Order tends to disorder over time. So to give a real example of this for you, here are two sets of two states following each other in time, so two processes. And I want you to think about which is more plausible. It's pretty easy, isn't it? So broken eggs never reassemble themselves, but they will fall apart if we drop them. There is no way for us to undrop an egg. But this is not our only experience of processes. So I'm going to show you another set of two processes now. And again, I want you to think about which is more plausible. Yes, that's right. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? This isn't just Zen. This is a fundamental challenge to the second law of thermodynamics. Order is somehow maintained by life in the face of increasing disorder. Life, in fact, does more than just maintain its order. Life increases the amount of order around it in general. Over the past 500 million years, we've moved from the primordial ooze to complex and ordered life forms, and of course, into an increasingly complex and ordered human economy. So that's not meant to be a value judgment on the complexity and order of humans, but clearly this looks like nothing like progress towards the heat death of the universe. Life builds up structures. They don't just fall apart like classical thermodynamics predicts. Now, my physics degree left it there with that conundrum, and to a large extent, physics itself left it there too. But a number of other disciplines have been working on this problem, trying to understand what happens away from thermal equilibrium and what special thing it is that life does. And this is the discipline of non-equilibrium thermodynamics, or NET. So I want to introduce a technical term of free energy now. This refers to concentrations of energy which haven't been shared around the system just yet. So that can be energy coming into a system like sunlight from the sun, or energy captured in chemicals like petrol. But it can also be the energy captured by the structure of materials being in unusual configurations or more ordered. So the classical interpretation of thermodynamics suggests that it is inevitable that over time, free energy will be eroded or better shared out and evenly eventually distributed through the system, which therefore reaches thermal equilibrium. But as I've highlighted, life seems to buck this trend and do the opposite, creating more and more structure and free energy over time. NET says that this is still part of our understanding of the second law of thermodynamics. So Eric Schneider is one of a number of thermodynamicists who have helped restate the second law. And his version is nature abhors a gradient. So what does that mean? To explain, let's think about a temperature gradient. One side of something is hot, the other is cool. So this is a free energy gradient because there is a difference in heat energy from one place to another. Heat will naturally flow from the hotter side through the sample to the cooler side over time, bringing them into thermal equilibrium. In a lab, however, you can maintain a temperature gradient, keeping the temperatures either side constant, and watch what happens. And that's what these charts show. In the center is a graph showing how much heat is passed through a sample of fluid as the temperature gradient increases left to right. When the temperature gradient is low, only conduction heat passes heat through. So conduction is just the disorganized bumping together of the molecules in the sample. That's the bottom line and the picture on the left. You can see that as the gradient increases, conduction passes more and more heat across, so it has a positive gradient on this chart. But more interesting is that when the temperature gradient gets to beyond a certain higher level, a second process, convection, can start up creating currents of billions and billions of molecules, which makes hotter and cooler fluid faster by rotating them like a whirlpool. This is more effective in passing heat through the sample, and so the second line has a steeper gradient. There's a certain minimum temperature gradient where convection can't take enough energy to occur. But once that gradient passes a critical point, it is inevitable that convection currents will start up and will form a more complex structure. And these complex structures increase the rate that the gradient overall is dissipated. Convection currents are structures involving huge numbers of molecules that spontaneously fall into line to form structures which improve the dissipation of free energy. And NET would see this as part and parcel of the second law. Nature compels complex structures to form, in this case convection currents, to dissipate gradients once they're beyond a certain size. So nature abhors an energy gradient, or maybe better, nature prefers structure to excessive gradients of free energy. On the way to the heat death of the universe, nature creates structures to bring the heat death along quicker. So the Earth interrupts an intense temperature gradient with the radiative heat of this sun at about 6,000 Kelvin at its surface, traveling on its way to the wider universe, which has a temperature of about 2.7 degrees from absolute zero. On the right, that's an image of the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is the leftover signature of the Big Bang, observed to be at that sort of temperature. And the Earth provides a stepping stone of about 280 Kelvin between the two. So it receives the heat of a 6,000 Kelvin object and is heated to about 280. That means it drops the 6,000 to 2.7 Kelvin gradient to a gradient of only 280 to 2.7 Kelvins. It would do this if it had no atmosphere, but actually the Earth is cooled further by other structures that form on its surface. So there are 6 huge convection currents formed in our atmosphere because this increases the erosion of the solar energy gradient. The global climate cools the Earth by moving heat more quickly from hotter to cooler longitudes than conduction would do alone. So just like within the sample under lab conditions, the main cycles are created as air expands and contracts. But energy is also absorbed when water evaporates and forms clouds, and it is released further away when it condenses and it rains. This is called latent heat. The heat absorbed by evaporating water and moving this latent heat around also increases the dispersion of energy, which increases the rate of cooling of the solar gradient. And many other structures arise spontaneously to erode more local energy gradients in the climate. So hurricanes speed up the mixing of warm and wet air when formed close to the surface with cooler and drier air in the atmosphere. This speeds up the vertical distribution of heat, again, much faster than conduction would do alone. And it's not just dead fluids which do this mixing of heat. Life also helps to erode the solar energy gradient by evaporating water. About 2/3 of the energy of the sun which hits a tree is actually used to draw water out of the ground and evaporate it into the air. This is called evapotranspiration and converts the sunlight into latent heat, increasing the erosion of the solar energy gradient. Trees are dramatically more powerful than the sun alone, acting to evaporate the water soaked into soil. So really, a tree's main use of sunlight is to act as an air conditioner, cooling the earth and eroding the solar energy gradient. The production of sugars is really just a sideline in terms of thermodynamics. Photosynthesis itself, of course, further cools the earth in that it captures a portion of energy in sugars which would otherwise be absorbed by the earth's heat, which would warm it. But this function is small in proportion to the evaporation of water. And we can measure this cooling effect from space. So this image is a little complex, but it shows measurements of the energy leaving different regions of the Earth. Here, the numbers are watts per square meter, so the lower the number, the cooler the surface temperature being observed. And you can see that the Amazon in the centre of the picture emits about 1/3 less heat than South Australia on the left, despite being significantly closer to the equator and receiving more sunlight. The Amazon is cooled by the trees moving the heat of the sun around. So the second law of thermodynamics shows us that increasing structure on Earth is inevitable, as it increases the erosion of the solar energy gradient over time, even though this means more energy and order is created on Earth. The route for the heat death of the universe goes through a phase of increasing complexity. So a barren rock in space will erode the sun's free energy by providing a stepping stone between the sun and the cosmos. In the presence of gases and liquids, that rock will spontaneously form climactic structures. And in the presence of enough chemical complexity, life will spontaneously form to erode the energy gradient even more rapidly. And in the presence of complex communicating organisms, social and economic structures will spontaneously form to help cool the Earth further. Now, these two are obviously radical statements. NET hints that life and economies are inevitable as they increase the rate free energy is dissipated towards heat. They increase the speed that we are moving towards the heat death of the universe. But maybe human structures are not doing a very good job to the extent that they interrupt the cooling done by other parts of the Earth system already. Damage to the climate system and damage to the ecosphere both carry the potential to harm the Earth's cooling mechanisms. So we can see that there are a number of structures formed on Earth due to it being in the way of the sunlight going on to disperse in the wider universe. On the far left, we have the convection currents of the climate moving hotter air to cooler regions. Then we have the evaporation of water, which happens without life, but then plants increase the level of activity. Then we have photosynthesis, which is a distinct way of capturing more of the sun's energy as sugars. And then we have respiration, which captures the sugars made in photosynthesis as a new energy gradient to harness. So one of the main questions has to be how the human economy fits in. It harnesses both photosynthesis and respiration in feeding humans, but clearly it does more than that. What I want to finish this section on thermodynamics with then is a quick look at the types of structure that have formed here. And this is really the beginning of my own work and analysis. So I would describe the structures on the left as having an informal structure. There is no persistent template for the shape of a hurricane or the polar vortex. In the presence of an energy gradient, they arise spontaneously, but once that gradient has been eroded and gone, they fall away. So thinking of them as machines, these structures are inefficient because they are constantly being pushed apart, pushed around an optimal design for dispersing energy. A hurricane spinning faster because it has successfully absorbed more energy in its rotation actually loses its shape by centrifugal force, becoming less efficient in mixing air currents as a result. So these informal structures are constantly competing to gain access to energy gradients, but the success of that competition may well make them less able to compete in future. But that is not the case for living and economic structures, where there is an external template of design. So I'll refer to this as formal structure, which means fundamentally that it is repeatable because it is using stored information to retain its design. With life, the templates are held in its DNA. And with economic structures, the templates are held in the human mind, the printed page, and computers. Each time an organism is born or a product finished, it is as well designed as the previous version of it, as well designed to harness energy gradients. And the more energy that is captured by an organic or economic machine, the more energy it has to dedicate to making sure that that structure remains in the environment. So this is the replication of forms that my work is looking at. And of course, the organic and economic machines available at any one time compete with each other to harness energy gradients and the materials to copy themselves. But it is through errors in copying their design that they evolve. Over time, Errors can either improve the future population of machines, increasing the rate at which they harness the energy gradient, or they can open up new energy gradients, or they can fall away. This kind of survival applies both within life and within the economy. Thermodynamics then helps us to explain competition by explaining why organic and economic machines will always be greedy in the pursuit of more. More energy and material resources leads to more copies left behind in the system. And because replication is what they were designed to do. This doesn't fully explain how our economy functions though, so I will return to this chart later. So thermodynamics actually predicts complex structures, life, and its evolution. And this is not how I was taught this topic in physics. I think it is time for investors and for economics to reappraise this topic. But to explain these formal structures, we really need to talk about encoding and information. It is this encoding which enables structures to be replicated and made consistent over time. This is the critical technology convection and evaporation lack. So my conclusion is that following how information is replicated is a vital tool to understand what it is our system does, using the parallels between living systems and human ones as they act to harness energy gradients to copy themselves. And this introduces the section of my own work. So life harnesses energy gradients to copy itself using materials from its environment. If we look at how a tree performs this, we can see that it brings in materials from its environment through its roots with water and nutrients, and through its leaves in terms of carbon dioxide. It also excretes waste in terms of oxygen from the leaves. We know that photosynthesis is at the heart of its energy requirements, and this process happens in its leaves, converting sunlight into sugars. And its transportation requirements are met by its sap drawn up through its trunk by evapotranspiration and cycling materials throughout its structure. But none of that explains how its structure is formed from the information in its DNA. To do that, we need to look at 3 additional functions going on in the cells of the tree, which together enable DNA to be copied and turned into living structure. These are the functions of assembly of information strings, their manipulation into functional forms, and the separation and storage of information and its communication. So here I have stylized a cell looking at its functions. We've already noted the need for materials to enter and exit, for transportation, and for an energy source already. So let's look at the copying of information. Imagine we have some bits of data on the left and an assembled string of information in the middle. In living processes, these are nucleic acids as the bits of information and a gene as the string. To replicate the string, organisms use a series of enzymes which come together as an assembler which copies genes regardless of the information that the gene actually carries. The assembly process lines up the nucleic acids next to the parent to form the new gene. The new copy sits over on the right of this slide. This is transcription, maintaining the language the information is recorded in. But the gene alone is just information and it cannot do anything. To become functional in organisms, the string is first translated into amino acids which have the same information but use a different set of chemicals, like a different language. This is another function of assembly, translation. The amino acid string is then folded into a new configuration, bringing together different areas of the code to make it into a functioning enzyme. So in cells, this manipulator is called the endoplasm reticulum, which takes an information string and folds it into a functional enzyme. And of course, all of these functions are carried out by enzymes. So enzymes must be distributed to all parts of the cell. These steps are how a cell converts information into the structures which go and compete for energy gradients in the system. Now, information about how best to compete for energy gradients embodies all of the learning of the history of the organism's evolution. So it is a critically valuable resource. This embedded learning makes successful information very high in free energy because the order that the bits of information come in is vital. most errors will destroy its ability to compete for resources, and the information will decay if it's not protected and exposed to the random motions of heat. So to protect it, cells have another structure, which is the nucleus. And of course, this comes with its own set of enzymes to make that storage work. Finally, then, this separation of information also requires a function to select which pieces are passed for assembly and entry into the wider system. This is the communication of information from one place to another, which becomes required when information is separated from the place it is used. So the final point I'd like to bring onto this already busy slide is that materials don't enter the cell structures as nucleic or amino acids already. This is a job that has to be done within the cell. So I'll rename this function as refining, which is purifying and structuring materials to make them consumable by the cell, and recycling or reconfiguring damaged materials to make them fit for purpose within the cell again. Transportation now picks up the physical movement of raw materials and wastes into and out of the cell. So now we can look at the parallels as to where this replication of information happens in the human system. So I've put on the same 6 functions of replicating a replicating organism must have on the top line. And on the bottom line of the table, I've mapped them onto example economic structures. It's no surprise that we recognize these sectors in economic analysis, but perhaps the approach of starting from the first principles of replication is new. Of course, not everything in the system of economic replication is carried out by human-designed machines. Many of the most important functions, like refining oxygen for us to breathe or capturing CO2 to maintain temperatures, is carried out by living systems. These are not two separate and parallel systems. They are intertwined, and it is important for us to know and select where living and human systems are to be relied upon. So this does paint a picture of the physical economy, and I think it is really important that we recognize that even in an information age, our economy is physical. Our information systems are physical, whether the written book, human mind, the sound waves of the spoken word, or the electrons on a server or cable. Even when I purchase digital material like access to the latest Taylor Swift track, that information is hosted physically on a server, and when replicated, it is passed down physical cables or physical electromagnetic waves. Those servers need replicating physically, and Taylor herself had to be physically present somewhere to write and record the song. We can trade information, but we'll have to have some physical impact somewhere. The virtual nature of information is that it is meaningless until manipulated by other physical structures, giving it its function. So information is always somewhere physical. I'll come back to what energy gradients information helps to erode, but that must all be part of the full thermodynamic interpretation. But to me, this chart also highlights the big difference between the structures created by life compared to those in an economy. So living organisms, by and large, must carry information for the full set of replication functions themselves. Economic systems, in other words, a human institution, including companies, do not. Human information is more like a virus, in that it can be replicated without carrying the full set of information about how it is to be replicated. A company doesn't have to give birth to or train up every component of their workforce or create every machine they use from a raw material. They may not even hold the information of how to design their own products. Unlike an organism, a company only has to compete in one element of the replication of economic information. They compete with each other to degrade energy gradients nonetheless, but the replication process is very, very different. It is shared throughout the economy. The economy as a whole is the thing that is replicated. And this lack of needing to carry all of the information of replication gives rise to what I'd refer to as hyperevolution. So what do I mean by hyperevolution? Well, first, let's just grapple with the evolution of technology. So human technology evolves in much the same way as living technologies. We call it economic competition, But ultimately, this is a trial and error process to see what can best harness an energy gradient to carry out a replication function. And here is an example of technology carrying a transportation function in the economy. So cars have improved in many ways over the past century or so, becoming faster and more fuel efficient, safer, and all the while better at moving materials and information around this human system. This means better at increasing the degradation of energy gradients for the purpose of replicating the economic system. But in one generation, cars could go electric and had no intermediate forms needing to be solved. All of the components can be created separately and trialed elsewhere, but no complex organism was cobbled together from the components of different species. Humans can carry out the trial and error of technology in their own minds, or now with their computers, selecting a design to build without ever having to mutate existing technologies physically. All told, this is hyper-evolutionary. So human or economic information is different to DNA, but it creates structures which compete to degrade the energy gradients in the same way as DNA. So our ecosystem can now take huge leap forwards in technology overnight, which was totally unknown to DNA-based self-replicating complex life. And clearly, this brings dangers of sustainability with it. We do not know which older technologies will be affected by a new technology once released on the world. Some older technologies may be right to be outcompeted because they are inefficient, but some may be important to our way of life as we know it. So even if it is hosted on physical devices, there is a separate virtual economy of ideas, the information economy. It follows from the rest of this presentation that we should be asking what energy gradients these ideas harness. They're not just replicating without access to energy, so what makes them attract that energy in the system? Well, a large part of this information economy consists of ideas about how we structure ourselves, our machines and our groups. And I'll refer to this as providing organizational structure. Organizing information succeeds in that it helps the humans who know it and the physical economy they manage to capture greater energy gradients and materials for replication. So rewarding this information by being protected or stored and passed on to each other as lessons, it is that passing on of information which constitutes its replication. Money, debt, and finance are all organizational technologies which enable energy, materials, and information to be brought from one place and so empower other organizing technologies, such as how to create a business and organize a factory line. Now that we have entirely decoupled this technology from physical constraints with fiat currencies, this means that finance can become more focused on replicating money rather than replicating the economy. Without some limits between its operation as an information technology and its ability to buy physical goods and services, it could erode our existing structures. The second part of the information economy is dedicated to capturing the attention of our minds, which use energy to think. This is what makes Taylor Swift so economically valuable. She can capture thought space and attention. But this extends to explaining the social media economy and the addiction that you may have to your mobile device. Social media is very deliberately designed to capture your attention. This is the attention economy. And of course, it's not just the attention and processing power of computers. It is also the attention and processing power of computers which erodes energy gradients, not just human brain cells. Perhaps it is the fact that computer processing erodes energy gradients that explains Bitcoin and other mineable digital currencies' popularities. They are inelastic currencies because they have taken so much energy to create, unlike fiat elastic currencies. And of course, no idea can be solely categorized as purely organizational or attentional. There is a spectrum information sits on between these two extremes. Everything you think about takes attention, and everything you think about shapes the way you address or organize the world. How many people have said, I've learned more from Taylor Swift than I care to think? Now, I'll stop there before I get too philosophical or pretend to be obsessed with Taylor anymore. But I also think that gradient erosion helps to explain our society and our psychology. So I wanted to return to this chart to try and answer one of the questions I outlined earlier. Just what is it that the economy does thermodynamically? So I've simplified things here by collapsing together convection and evaporation into non-living, and photosynthesis and respiration into organisms. But I've also separated out humans because we are special, in that we are able to create physical encodings of a different kind of information with ideas and with memes. And we also use those ideas to create the physical, formal structures of our economy. But we should also recognize on this chart a more virtual information economy. And here are the points from the previous page. The information economy offers us the ability to organize our physical and human structures better, and of course, sometimes just competes for our attention and the attention of our computers. All of this is in the pursuit of eroding energy gradients and capturing materials for replication. So to round up, I do believe that we can have a top-down description of the natural world, including the human economy. This means that there is the potential for us to properly establish what sustainability means. Now, I didn't look into ecology in this talk, but I'll note that ecology points to definitions of sustainability in terms of moving towards a climax community. The climax community of species, the mature forest, contains long-lived organisms with low reproduction numbers, and importantly for us, one which retains much of its material within the system. I'll also note, however, that the ecological climax community is not a panacea analogy for a sustainable economy, as it is vulnerable both to external threats and, more importantly, vulnerable to evolution over time. Species get more efficient at competing with each other for energy gradients, and this leads to a fragile stability. But organic evolution happens slowly compared to the hyper-evolution of human technology. In any case, ecology tells us that sustainability probably accepts a lower level of efficiency and builds in redundancies to take over if other parts of the system fails. Now, I touched on my interpretation of money. Essentially, I would argue that we need to separate the currencies of our economic functioning between physical and virtual activity. It is too easy for the attention economy to appropriate power to itself without being able to use it for the benefit of the system as a whole. And that is a feature of purely virtual social technology like fiat money. And finally, to address the growth question, growth seeking is an entirely natural phenomenon in terms of technology appropriating the material required for it to perpetuate itself. But because humans have shared the replication functions into a series of separate companies, we never know whether the success of capital in one link of the replication chain enhances or reduces the ability for the chain overall to replicate. So I would argue that more explicit choices need to be made in how we reward business to try to ensure the continuance of our ability to replicate our rich economy. That probably means less emphasis on profit and more emphasis on the requirements of the economy from a replication perspective. We do not replicate our economy without other organisms and the climate helping to erode energy gradients. So I hope you found that interesting. Many thanks for your attention.